The cathedral that you see in front of you is the Canterbury Cathedral, the one I mentioned the other day, the cathedral where, and it's super famous because that is the cathedral that is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most famous Archbishop of Canterbury being Thomas à Becket, who was murdered on the steps of the cathedral by some overzealous knights who were trying to obey their king's orders. And they mussed it up. Yeah. And again, you look at the fluting, that's the ribbing on all the columns and all the big light up there, and everything's meant to lift your eyes upward to the height of this cathedral. These cathedrals are the height of not just religious life of the era, but also the very height of artistic life as well of the early medieval period. Okay, just some general announcements here before we go. Let me pray, and then we'll give some announcements and start our class for today. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for today, for this class. Thank you for Olivia's joining us today, for just the ability that we have to meet online. Pray for the families of those affected by COVID, that especially those who are in the hospital or who maybe COVID has even taken their loved ones, that you would give them comfort during this time when it's difficult to be near to people. In your name, amen. All right, so you submitted your summer book reports on Friday. As an FYI, those will be graded within 2 weeks. That's my goal. That's my goal. We'll see how well I do with that. I'm a famous procrastinator, and man, essays are hard to grade. Late and missing work is updated on RunWeb. However, if you're looking on RunWeb and you're seeing something recorded as missing and you're like, no, I turned that in, please tell me, because it might be that I just missed it in an email or message somewhere as I was going through stuff. I tried to check my email for things, but sometimes things fall through the cracks, and sometimes I forget to put them in the little folder that I have for coursework. So I am a human being, and I do mess up. So if your grade is missing something you're pretty sure it shouldn't be, please let me know. The next thing is I graded the vocab quizzes and the vocab quiz and the early Middle Ages quiz that we took. So here's just a couple of things from that quiz. First off, in the vocab quiz, our probably most missed question was the word askew, in writing a sentence with the word askew. Lots of people wrote askew from something, but you don't askew from things, you just askew them. So you don't need the word from in there. So that's why you would have gotten a 1 out of 2 on that one. There were a few other mistakes on other questions as well, but that was probably the most common. If you have a question about, you're like, why did I miss a point on this? Please email me. I would love to be able to answer and explain why you might be missing a point on something. I can't actually comment on the quiz particular questions on Schoology, which is kind of annoying, because for some of them I'm just like, if you would just remove that one word, it would be fine. But I just can't actually make those comments. So that was probably the most common mistake on the vocab quiz. On the Beowulf quiz, the 4 traits, probably our big question was that essay question of what Beowulf meant, or how Beowulf, not what Beowulf meant, how Beowulf was an Anglo-Saxon hero. That was our big question. On that one, just be careful. I noticed a couple people had Googled some of how Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon hero there, because the traits that you mentioned weren't ones that were in my lecture or in the book. So please don't do that. There were also just a couple of cases where you were just missing, if you got some points marked off from there, you were missing maybe a few details, or the trait that you mentioned didn't quite line up with one of the traits mentioned in the book or in the class. So even though it may have been technically a thing for an Anglo-Saxon hero, this is supposed to be a quiz over this particular class work. So that's why you missed points on that. Next, the homework is to practice list 2 to 100% on vocabulary.com. That's by the, that's by tonight, isn't it? So that's specific dates for that are on Schoology. So you can go to Schoology, by the way, and we have our weekly outlook posted on Schoology that just says what everything is going on this week. So if you would like to take a look at that, you can. Today, basically, I was doing a lot of lecture, so sorry about that. But you will need to take notes and answer questions, so do stay alert. And stay up with me and what I'm talking about as we go. Oh, the vocab practice is due by Friday. There we go. I remember 9/4. I got it confused with 7th grade. Yeah, so make sure you get that vocab practice done on vocabulary.com. And then next week we'll take another quiz over those words. Any questions about the announcements? Okay, let's do a little bit of a review here. So, going over from the lecture of the other day, what year was the Battle of Hastings? What year did the Battle of Hastings take place? The Norman invasion. Go ahead and put your answer in the group chat. Again, if you don't know, take a guess, but this is your quiz grade for today. Oh yeah. So there should be, not quiz grade, participation grade. Wow, my brain. If you don't know, take a guess. What year did the Battle of Hastings or the Anglo-Saxon invasion take place? Yes, you're so close. Yeah, good guesses, good. Lots of people have it here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Took place in 1066 AD. In that Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror took over, right? And English culture shifts from being tribal to being feudal. It changes from the kingship being elected by a council to being hereditary. You change from kind of this Germanic culture and language to adding more French embellishments to that, because your upper class people speak mainly French. They dress mainly French. They follow the fashions of the French. And your lower class people all follow Anglo-Saxon traditions. We also had at this time, Henry II introduces a bunch of legal reforms. Does anyone remember any of the legal reforms that Henry II introduced? Henry II introduced some legal reform. Take a guess. Take a straight guess. Okay, good. Seeing some good guesses here. Oh, yeah. There you go, Bryce. Yeah, Victoria. So what legal reforms did, oh, good job, Venetia and Lauren. Legal reforms did Henry II introduce? Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, one, okay, his big thing, the big things that he did, there were 3 of them introduced in common law, which is like the rule of precedent, that you can't just make up a punishment for something every single time. You should follow the precedent that other judges have set and put their punishments, use the same punishment for the same crime. So that's common law. The second thing he did was the trial by a jury of your peers. So, but remember, that's only for noblemen at that point. They have a right to a trial. The king can't just be like, I don't like you, you're going to prison, and I don't have to tell you why, you're just going to prison. That issue, by the way, was a big deal in the French Revolution. You know, you could send prisoners away in secret. They didn't necessarily have a right to a trial. Then you have the other one is that he took away the church or clergy members' ability to be judges in the secular courts. So they could judge in canon law, but not in secular law. Okay, those 3 things. We also had in this era, so basically this era starts the feudal system, and we also start to see the decline or the lessening of that feudal system and the power of feudal lords. Because we also in this era have the signing of the Magna Carta, which lessened the power of the king by giving the noblemen the power of the purse. So the king can't tax noblemen without their consent. It also meant that the king is subject to the laws of the land. He can't just do whatever he wants. And it confirmed the idea that you can't just put noblemen in prison without giving them a trial. There has to be a fair trial by their peers. Okay, which foreshadows the English, and that whole idea of the peers, the noble, forcing them to give them administrative functions, foreshadows the Parliament. We also talked about the Roman Catholic Church and how it had some good things about it and some bad things about it in this era. What were some of the, and why it was important? So we talked about the reason why they had such great influence on the people was because the sacraments are required for salvation, and then just the general spiritual mindset of the people. We also talked about why the church was good and why it was bad in this era. So what are some of the reasons that the Roman Catholic Church was a good influence on the medieval period? What are some of the reasons that the Roman Catholic Church was a good influence on the period? Okay, good. Seeing a lot of Okay, so here are some of the reasons we talked about before. We talked about how they had charitable works that they did. We talked about how, like, everything from taking care of the poor and the sick, mainly those were to other types of charities and things that they had at the time. They basically took care of communities when the communities couldn't take care of themselves. We had the idea that they promoted academics, and so they actually wrote stuff down. And culture. They were the main avenue of culture in the era. They stabilized Europe because Europe is all underneath one religion, so you can't attack people anymore on the basis of religion if we're all the same religion. And we also had the idea of they created an atmosphere of prayer and spiritual awareness in the people. So kind of turning people towards understanding God. So good job with that question. Today, we move on. We're going to kind of continue what we did last time with this note taking. So listen to my lecture, write what you remember in your own words, or write it down as I go. And keep in mind that we are doing this for a reason. It's not just because I'm too lazy to make slides. I can make PowerPoint slides, but we're doing this because it stretches your memory. It's brain exercise. It's a good practice for college, and putting in your own words will help you remember it better if you actually take the time to write things down yourself. So that's what we're headed at today. We're gonna pick up where we left off with our lecture here. Uh-oh. I just lost where I was. Not quite. Okay, here we go. So we just talked about the Roman Catholic Church. Let's talk a little bit about the art and learning of the era. So the art and learning of the era. First, let's talk about art. The art of this period, the medieval period, focuses mainly on the church. Specifically, you can see this in the cathedrals, which we've talked about with the Canterbury Cathedral. We looked at that example. It's also in a bunch of examples like you look at the art that was made for cathedrals in stained glass windows and in icons and portraits that were put up in cathedrals. Art was mainly made for religious purposes in this period. Another big example of the art of the era happens in illuminated manuscripts. So illuminated manuscripts are copies of works that have art on the side. Basically, they're illustrated, illuminated manuscripts. Sometimes this is just as simple as having like a large fancy letter at the top. Sometimes this is a little more crazy, like the picture that was just on the last slide was a illustration in an illuminated manuscript. That was a big piece of the art of the era. So art is mainly focused on the church, and you can see that in cathedrals, and they also had illuminated manuscripts. Learning of this era is a big deal. Learning of this era is a big deal. The era is called the Dark Ages, right? So we typically look at it as a time of, after Rome, where we kind of lost all of our information and we were really dull and we slid backwards as a society, which is somewhat the case, but there's also a lot of change and growth that is happening in this period. So remember, we're covering a giant group of years from here. We're covering about 400 years worth of time. So think of it that in the difference of technology between now in the 2000s and in the 1600s is the amount of time we're covering. So at the beginning of this era, really only the elite had any amount of education, right? They're the only ones who can afford an education. Everyone else is mainly working fields or blacksmith, or you're a baker, you're a cook, you're a scullery maid, but for the most part, it's just your noblemen and your clergy members who can read and write. Eventually in this era, we start to see a few more people be able to read and write, and the education of your noblemen starts to change. And we have the beginning of humanism. We have the beginning of humanism. So this is one of the things you're going to want to know about the era, the learning of the era. We start humanism. And if you're like, well, what is humanism? Okay, the definition of medieval humanism is different than the definition of modern humanism. When we talk about modern humanism, we mean that man is the measure of all things. In other words, we judge truth by what humanity does. Humanist in this era means something different. In this era, humanist means people who are studying the texts of the humanities, basically subjects that deal with human culture or the human experience. This is why if you go to become a humanities major at college, that uses the medieval definition of humanism. So you will study things like art and literature and history and science. You'll kind of have a broad education. Our education here at Harvest is a humanities education. Okay, so humanism starts here. Now, humanism has two effects. First, it really pulled intellectual life away from the church. So before the start of humanism, really the only place you had to get information was with the church. With the beginning of humanism, though, you start to see people studying things in other ways. So the church has a little bit less control over what you're studying. Now, this doesn't mean that people were becoming a-religious. So they were still very religious people. And in fact, they studied human culture, human experience in order to know God better, was the original reason for studying these things. The second effect is we see the start of English universities like Oxford and Cambridge. So we start to see actual English higher education places, Oxford and Cambridge, begin in this period. One of the big reasons for the start of Oxford and Cambridge was actually because Henry II, remember the guy who did all of our legal reform, he banned attendance at the University of Paris, which is where people used to go before Oxford and Cambridge, and basically forced people to go to attend English universities because he wanted to see, we're starting to see the animosity of the 100 Years' War get started, and you want to see less ties with France. So that was one of the big things. So the two effects of humanism are we're pulling intellectual life away from the church and begin English universities like Oxford and Cambridge. The other aspect of learning that we have in this era is we start to see newer medical practices. As you might know, not all of these medical practices were effective. You had things like cures for the plague where it was, hold up a bare chicken butt to the pustule of black plague and that will make it go away. Or if you have another illness, you needed to go hang out somewhere that was really stinky, like a latrine, and that would make it go away. You had the idea of the 4 humors, that your body is made up of these 4 different fluids and they have to be in balance, which is where you get the idea of bloodletting. Some illnesses are caused by your having too much blood in your system, and so we just need to get rid of that blood. So we have leeches and we have other things. And some of those medical practices stuck around for a really long time, all the way into the 17 and 1800s, before we were like, I don't think that's effective anymore. However, this era did see new medical practices that were effective. We started to actually study anatomy and physiology a little more effectively to figure out some of the practices that we should start to see and to figure out how to be just better. And so we started to see some better medical practices and some better taking care of the sick and the wounded. So medical practices. The third new learning thing is we gained a lot of things from the Middle East. So we gained a lot from the Middle East. The reason, can anyone think of why we might have gained knowledge from the Middle East in this era? Why in the times of the medieval age would we have gained knowledge from the Middle East? Ooh, great. Josiah's got the answer here. The Crusades. The Crusades. Yeah, exactly. You had a bunch of people who were, you have a bunch of people who are headed over to the Middle East, supposedly to protect Christian lands or to take back Jerusalem for Christianity from the Muslim incursion. And however, when they went to the Middle East, they didn't just end up fighting there. They spent a lot of time there, and as a result, picked up key things in medicine, language. We got a lot of Arabic words infused into our language at this time. Spices. The Brits gained a lot of spices. You can kind of look at British history as invading places in order to get spices and then deciding that they don't want any because their food is notoriously bland. And then silks, things like that. We start to see bigger trade with the world and the influence of foreign things on England. So the Middle East influence is huge in this era. So that's art and learning in this era. Another change that takes place in this era deals with the life of a particular person. His influence on the country really cannot be understated, and he really paved the way for the Reformation that took place later on in the 1500s in England with the start of the Anglican Church. So the name of this guy who really changed English history is Wycliffe. 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 Although don't be too concerned about the spelling, because Wycliffe himself spelled his name like 17 different ways. So, because there was no, at this era, there was no standard spelling of anything, which to me sounds amazing, right? You don't have to spell it, you can spell it however you want. But Wycliffe is our super important guy. And he is known as, and this is important, we're going to call him the morning star of the Protestant Reformation. The morning star of the Protestant Reformation. He is the symbol of the oncoming Protestant Reformation. And he has a lot of Protestant ideas that we will see later on that come up in the 1500s. This guy, Wycliffe, has in the 1300s, so 200 years prior to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, this guy is already coming up with these ideas. So here are some of the things that Wycliffe was saying. Wycliffe said, the church shouldn't have political authority. You shouldn't have clergy members in government positions at all from his position. He believed in the separation of church and state. The second thing he believed is that the church shouldn't have legal immunity. If a clergy member kills somebody, he should get charged with murder in the civil courts. He shouldn't have immunity from that. If a clergy member steals from someone, he shouldn't have legal immunity. From things like bribery and all kinds of things. The church shouldn't have legal immunity. Number 3, the church should give up its wealth. The church shouldn't be so wealthy. The church, in fact, should be using all of its wealth to help the poor and to help different communities. So rather than building these grandiose cathedrals, in his opinion, we ought to be using all of that money to help the poor in the community. He also believed that clergy members shouldn't be immoral. They shouldn't be worldly. Clergy members should be living a pious life that is dedicated to God, that is set apart, that is holy. Clergy shouldn't be immoral or worldly. And then some of the 3 key doctrines here, the 3 really important ones that really set him apart and are the beginning of kind of key Protestant doctrines that we see throughout Martin Luther's work, throughout guys like Hess, all of their work. In his mind, there's no such thing as transubstantiation. Transubstantiation. Now, if you don't know what transubstantiation is the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox idea that the body and blood of Christ literally, or that the wine and the bread at communion or at Eucharist literally turn into the body and blood of Christ. Literally. So when Christ said at the Last Supper, this is my body, which was broken for you, this is my blood, which was shed for you, he meant it literally. In Wycliffe's mind, that's not a literal thing. The little cracker and the wine or the juice don't literally turn into the body and blood of Christ. Instead, this is a figurative thing. This is symbolic, and it's a reminder to us, but not the actual change. So this would be what most Protestants believe today, that when we take communion, it's a reminder, it's a figurative reminder of Christ's death and Christ's sacrifice for our sins, but it is not a literal change. The other really, really important doctrine that he believed is in the priesthood of the believers. So this is a doctrine set up mainly in Hebrews. Hebrews is a really complicated book that really transforms the way you look at the Old Testament into and shows how Christ really fulfilled prophecy and that kind of thing. And it's also in Peter. However, priesthood of the believers means that every individual believer does not need to go through a priest to get to God. I can pray directly to God, and he can directly answer me. I don't need to do confession because I confess my sins directly to God himself. I don't have to worry about going through an intermediary. No one else has to forgive my sins because no one else has the power to forgive my sins. Christ, God, is the only one who has that ability. And when Christ died and the veil in the temple tore in two, that is symbolic of the fact that we now have direct access to God. I don't have to pray to Mary or to other saints to hear my prayers. I can pray directly to God. He will answer me as an almighty, all-powerful being that can listen to everyone equally at all times. And then his last really, really, really important doctrinal belief here is that people, and this is surprising, people should read the Bible to know what it actually says. This is key here in a couple of ways. Number one, a lot of the clergy the clergy who are teaching the Bible couldn't even read themselves. Remember that there are two types of clergy, the secular and the common clergy, and the secular clergy are the ones who are actually preaching and teaching. A lot of those clergy members couldn't actually read or write. It was only some of the common clergy who are engaged in scholarship studies that could read and write. So if your pastor can't read the Bible and he's supposed to be preaching to you from the Bible, that's going to be a little difficult. And he believed that not only should the pastors read the Bible, but every single person should read the Bible. Because if there's a priesthood of believers and I am responsible for my own relationship with God, then I need to know who God is. And how do I find out who God is? By reading the Bible. Okay, so those are some of his key doctrine beliefs. The church shouldn't have political authority. The church shouldn't have legal immunity. The church should give up its wealth. The church shouldn't be immoral or worldly. There is no such thing as transubstantiation. There is the priesthood of the believers, and people should read the Bible. As a result of his belief that people should read the Bible, Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. This is the first full translation of the Bible into English in the history of the language. And this Bible translation becomes becomes the backbone of Bible translations in England for a long time, because he thought people should read it. He translated it, this huge work. He did have a lot of other people. He collected a lot of followers along him, people who agreed with him. These people were called Lollards, Lollard. And Lollard was not a very nice name at the time. Eventually, people started to see these Lollards as being radicals who were instigating maybe revolt even against the king. They saw, especially after they endorsed the Peasants' Revolt, they saw the Lollards as being someone who were trying to disrupt the unity of the English people, because at this time there's no such thing as you get to believe whatever you want, freedom of religion. At this point, the whole country has to believe one thing. And here you have this one guy who is coming around and saying that we should believe something else. There's a lot of kickback against that. So the Lollards were not necessarily loved, and in fact were persecuted heavily all the way till after the Protestant Reformation. But they did exist in the country. However, this belief in Lollardism that spread through the country, even a little bit, especially amongst peasants and people, made it so that people were aware of the flaws of the Roman Catholic Church, and made it so that people, when Protestantism did start to show up in Europe, And when Henry VIII says, hey, you know what, we're not going to be Roman Catholic anymore, and the entire country of England gets excommunicated for a while, when that happens, the people don't revolt. The people are like, yeah, you know what, yeah, let's not be Roman Catholic anymore, because of the work of Wycliffe and his Lollards. Okay, so that's Wycliffe. The next thing I want to talk about is kind of the fall of feudalism here. So feudalism, we talk about its rise in Europe in England in 1066, but it also falls quite quickly. And by around 1485, it's really gone. Here are some of the reasons that it falls. There are three big reasons that feudalism gets destroyed. Here are the three reasons. First of all is the Great Famine. The Great Famine, now there were a bunch of famines that happened in England, sometimes it was just be a specific era or area where they have a bad harvest. You know, there was too much rain in this one spot, there was not enough rain. Planting and farming techniques were not as efficient as they are today. But what happened in the Great Famine is you had years back to back of a majority of the land having bad harvests. And this caused lots and lots of commoners to starve to death. Lots of commoners starved. So the Great Famine, you have a bunch of commoners starved to death. The second thing is the Black Death. In the Black Death, you have 30 to 45% of England die. 30 to 45% of English people die. And there was a higher number of clergy members who die. And in some communities, 90% of the community would die. So let's just picture that. If the pandemic here on Guam were to worsen, and suddenly we have 30% of our entire population of Guam die of coronavirus, that's what the Black Death did within a couple of years. And this plague didn't just hit once and then was gone, it kept recurring. So it would be gone for like 10 years, and then 10 years later it would come back, and then you'd see a resurgence of it, and it was terrifying. And until we really got that figured out much later in around the 1600s, the Black Death continued to be a plague on the English people. But when it first came, it killed 30 to 45% of the English population. Okay, the Black Death specifically had three effects. Number one, it lost faith in the church. People believed that the plague was sent to punish the corrupt church. So they started to lose faith in the Roman Catholic Church. This again paves the way for the Protestant Reformation that will happen during the time of the Renaissance. The second effect of the Black Death is that it increased crime and violence, and it put additional pressure on feudalism. Because most of that 30 to 45% of the people that died were peasants. So now you've had a bunch of peasants who starved and a bunch of peasants who died of the Black Death. And then thirdly, you have the peasants' revolt. The peasants decide, you know what, we're sick of being tied to the land and treated like slaves. We want more power, we want more authority, we're sick of being treated the way we are, give us bread, and they revolt. When the peasants revolt, you see the basic discontent of feudalism, and the noble lords are forced to make some concessions to the peasants. So those three things caused the fall of feudalism: the Great Famine, the Black Death, and the peasant revolt. Because basically once your peasant population is gone, you can't continue with what you can't continue the way you were before, because feudalism is based on you have to have a large population of peasants to support a smaller number of nobles. But if you lose peasants get more freedom, because now there's different jobs that they can choose to do. There's more wiggle room in the job market, and that caused the collapse of feudalism. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is literature. The biggest change in literature is that now we write it down. In the Anglo-Saxon era, most of literature was oral literature, with a few cases like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Beowulf and some of the stories that Alfred the Great collected that were written down. But for the most part, literature was communicated orally. In the Middle Ages, in the high and late Middle Ages, we start to see more people reading and writing because of that increase in education we talked about earlier. And so now we write down literature. This caused a couple changes. Number one, we start to see new styles of writing from the continent. New styles of writing come in from the continent. Those two of the main styles that come in are poetry, which now has rhyme and meter, and lyric poetry, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So poetry now has rhyme and meter. Lyric poetry, the basic idea of lyric poetry is that it's musical sounding poetry that doesn't have to tell a story. And the second style that comes in is the romance. The romance is a story about a questing knight. Romance is a story about a questing knight. So we typically today think about romance as being a guy in love with a girl. In the Middle Ages, romance doesn't mean a guy in love with a girl. Romance means questing knights. It means stories about knights on adventures. Okay, the other change that happens in literature is, you know how we had shifted to kind of writing some things in English? Yeah, well, we shifted back to Latin for a long time, and then we shifted back to English. So there was this change of, we were writing in Latin, then we wrote back in old Anglo-Saxon English, then we wrote back in Latin, and now we're back to writing in English. Happened in this era. So lots of language. As a result, we get more words from Latin filter into the English language. We also changed some themes. Basic themes, mostly literature is still upper class. And in the upper class, the themes are, you have the idea of chivalry and courtly love are the big themes. Chivalry and courtly love. And all the stories for upper class people are very didactic. They're meant to teach these upper class citizens what kind of a person they should be. So chivalry, courtly love, and they're all didactic. For middle and lower class people, you have stories about native heroes, and then you have just everyday concerns, basically struggle and sorrow mixed with the joy of life. So those are kind of our big themes of the era. Okay, so sorry about today, ton of lecture, but really that's all we have for today. I'll review some things with you guys tomorrow, and then we'll move on to talking about the idea of what a hero is in this era, and probably the most famous English stories of all time and the most English stories of all time, the tales of King Arthur. All right, so if you have any questions for class, you can stick around. Otherwise, you guys can be dismissed.